The relationship between mental states and physical outcomes has occupied human inquiry for millennia, yet only in recent decades have we begun to accumulate systematic evidence about the mechanisms through which thoughts, beliefs, and expectations influence bodily processes. This is not a story about mysticism or supernatural forces, but rather an exploration of how the brain, as a physical organ embedded within a larger biological system, generates states that we experience as mental, and how those states feed back into the body's regulatory systems in ways that produce measurable physiological changes. The investigation of these phenomena spans neuroscience, immunology, endocrinology, psychology, philosophy, and clinical medicine, and the findings that have emerged challenge some long-held assumptions about the separation between mind and body, while simultaneously raising new questions that remain far from resolved. To understand how we arrived at our current understanding, we must first recognize that the very framing of the question reflects a particular intellectual history. The sharp distinction between mental and physical phenomena that dominated Western thought for several centuries emerged from specific philosophical and religious contexts that were not universal across human cultures. In many traditional medical systems, including those that developed in China, India, and among various indigenous populations, the idea that emotional states, social relationships, and physical health were interconnected was simply assumed rather than treated as a puzzle requiring explanation. The challenge that modern science faced was therefore not discovering something entirely new, but rather developing methods rigorous enough to test these intuitions and distinguish genuine causal relationships from coincidence, confirmation bias, and the natural fluctuations of disease processes. The placebo effect represents perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of how expectations and beliefs translate into physical outcomes, and its study has revealed complexities that were not anticipated when researchers first began to investigate it systematically in the mid-20th century. The term itself comes from the Latin word meaning "I shall please," and it was initially used in medical context to describe inert treatments given to satisfy patients rather than to produce any genuine therapeutic benefit. Early controlled trials were designed primarily to screen out placebo responses in order to identify the real effects of active treatments. But over time, researchers began to recognize that the placebo response itself was a phenomenon worthy of investigation in its own right. What they discovered was that placebos could produce measurable changes not only in subjective experiences like pain and mood, but also in objective physiological parameters, including hormone levels, immune function, and neural activity patterns. The magnitude of placebo effects varies considerably depending on the condition being treated, the characteristics of the treatment context, and individual differences among patients. In pain research, placebo analgesia has been particularly well documented, with studies showing that inert treatments can reduce pain ratings by 30 to 40% in many experimental paradigms. Crucially, neuroimaging research has demonstrated that placebo analgesia is not simply a matter of patients reporting less pain while experiencing the same underlying sensation, but rather involves actual changes in how the brain processes nociceptive signals. Activation of endogenous opioid systems has been implicated in many placebo analgesic responses, as evidenced by studies showing that the opioid antagonist naloxone can partially block placebo pain relief. However, opioid mechanisms do not account for all placebo analgesia, and researchers identified additional pathways involving endocannabinoids, dopamine, and other neurotransmitter systems. The conditioning model of placebo effects draws on classical conditioning principles to explain how repeated pairings between a treatment context and a physiological response can establish learned associations that persist even when the active treatment is replaced with an inert substitute. This mechanism was elegantly demonstrated in a series of studies conducted in the 1970s and 1980s by Robert Ader and Nicholas Cohen, who showed that immunosuppression could be conditioned in rats. In their experiments, animals were given a novel-tasting saccharin solution paired with an immunosuppressive drug. After several pairings, the saccharin solution alone could produce measurable suppression of immune responses, demonstrating that a complex physiological system previously thought to operate autonomously could be influenced by learned associations. This finding opened up an entirely new field of research known as psychoneuroimmunology, which investigates the bidirectional communication pathways between the nervous system and the immune system. The expectation model of placebo effects emphasizes the role of conscious beliefs and anticipations in generating physiological changes. According to this view, when a person expects a treatment to produce a particular outcome, that expectation activates neural circuits that can actually bring about the expected change. This model helps explain why the manner in which a treatment is administered matters so much for its effects. A medication given by a confident, authoritative physician in a prestigious medical setting tends to produce stronger responses than the same medication given in a more casual or uncertain context. The colour, size and shape of pills influence their perceived potency, with larger pills generally assumed to be stronger and certain colours associated with particular types of effects. Even the price of a treatment can influence its efficacy, with more expensive placebos producing greater effects than identical but cheaper-seeming alternatives. The neurobiological mechanisms underlying expectation effects have been partially elucidated through careful experimental work. When a person expects pain relief, activity increases in the prefrontal cortex, particularly in areas involved in executive function and cognitive control. This prefrontal activation appears to modulate activity in downstream regions, including the periaqueductal grey matter, a brainstem structure that plays a crucial role in descending pain modulation. The periaqueductal grey can suppress pain signals ascending from the spinal cord, effectively turning down the volume on incoming nociceptive information before it reaches conscious awareness. This top-down regulatory pathway provides a plausible mechanism through which cognitive expectations could translate into genuine alterations in pain perception, rather than simply affecting how much discomfort a person chooses to report. Individual differences in placebo responsiveness have been the subject of considerable research, though the picture that has emerged is more complicated than initially anticipated. Early hopes that a single placebo responder personality type could be identified have not been borne out, as responsiveness appears to vary not only between individuals but within individuals across different contexts and conditions. Some genetic factors have been associated with placebo responsiveness, particularly variations in genes involved in dopamine and opioid neurotransmission. For example, certain variants of the catechols-O1 methyltransferase gene, which affects dopamine metabolism, have been linked to stronger placebo responses in some studies. However, genetic factors explain only a portion of the variance in placebo responsiveness, and contextual factors including the therapeutic relationship, treatment setting, and prior experiences with medical care appear to play substantial roles. The nocebo effect represents the dark mirror of placebo phenomena, occurring when negative expectations produce harmful outcomes. If patients are warned that a medication may cause headaches, a significant proportion will develop headaches even when given an inert placebo. And this effect is not simply a matter of heightened attention to normal bodily sensations. Nocebo effects have been documented across a wide range of conditions and have important clinical implications. In some cases, patients discontinue beneficial treatments due to side effects that are actually nocebo responses rather than pharmacological effects. The ethical challenges surrounding nocebo effects are considerable because physicians have legal and ethical obligations to inform patients about potential risks. Yet providing this information may actually increase the likelihood that patients will experience those risks. The relationship between stress and physical health represents another domain in which the influence of mental states on bodily processes has been extensively documented. The stress response evolved as an adaptive mechanism for dealing with acute threats, mobilizing physiological resources for fight or flight through activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. In the short term, stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline enhance alertness, redirect blood flow to muscles, and suppress non-essential functions like digestion and immune activity. These changes are well suited to dealing with immediate physical dangers, but become problematic when the stress response is chronically activated in response to ongoing psychological stresses that do not require physical action. Chronic stress has been associated with a wide range of adverse health outcomes, including cardiovascular disease, impaired immune function, accelerated cellular aging, and increased risk of various chronic conditions. The mechanisms linking chronic stress to these outcomes are multiple and interconnected. Elevated cortisol levels over extended periods can promote the deposition of abdominal fat, increase blood pressure, raise blood glucose levels, and suppress immune function. The immune suppression associated with chronic stress appears to increase susceptibility to infectious diseases and may impair the body's ability to detect and eliminate cancerous cells, though the relationship between stress and cancer progression remains an area of active investigation with mixed findings across different cancer types and research methodologies. One of the more intriguing findings in stress research involves the role of perception and interpretation in moderating the health effects of stressful experiences. Not all individuals who face objectively stressful circumstances develop the health problems associated with chronic stress, and research has identified several factors that appear to buffer against these effects. A sense of control over one's circumstances, even if that control is more perceived than actual, tends to reduce the physiological impact of stressors. Social support serves as another important buffer, with individuals who have strong social connections showing less pronounced stress responses than those who are more isolated. The meaning that individuals attribute to stressful experiences also matters, as people who can find some sense of purpose or growth potential in difficult circumstances tend to fare better than those who view the same circumstances as purely negative. Research conducted in the 1990s and 2000s began to reveal that the belief that stress is harmful may itself be a significant factor in the relationship between stress and health outcomes. A study published in 2012 analysed data from a large national survey and found that high levels of stress were associated with increased mortality risk, but only among individuals who believed that stress was harmful to their health. Those who reported high stress but did not believe stress was harmful showed no increased mortality risk compared to those reporting low stress. This finding suggested that changing how people think about stress might be as important as reducing stress exposure, though the interpretation of these results remains debated and subsequent research has produced somewhat mixed findings. The emerging field of health psychology has developed interventions aimed at modifying how individuals interpret and respond to stressful situations. Stress reappraisal techniques teach people to view the physiological symptoms of stress not as harmful, but as the body preparing for action. Rather than interpreting a racing heart and sweaty palms as signs that one is falling apart, individuals learn to recognize these sensations as evidence that their body is mobilizing resources to meet a challenge. Some experimental research has found that such reappraisal can alter physiological responses to stress, producing patterns that are associated with better cardiovascular health than the responses typical of threat-focused stress reactions. However, questions remain about how durable these effects are and whether brief laboratory interventions translate into lasting changes in real-world stress responses. The investigation of how mental states influence immune function has produced findings that would have seemed implausible to scientists working just a few decades ago. The immune system was long regarded as autonomous, responding to pathogens and other biological threats through mechanisms that operated independently of psychological states. The discovery of neural and hormonal pathways linking the brain to immune organs and cells fundamentally changed this picture. Sympathetic nerve fibers innervate lymphoid tissues, including the spleen, thymus, and lymph nodes, providing a direct anatomical pathway through which neural activity can influence immune function. Additionally, immune cells possess receptors for various neurotransmitters and hormones, allowing them to respond to chemical signals originating from the nervous and endocrine systems. Studies have documented effects of psychological states on specific immune parameters, including the activity of natural killer cells, the production of various cytokines, the proliferation of lymphocytes in response to antigens, and antibody production following vaccination. Depression, for instance, has been associated with alterations in multiple immune parameters, though the clinical significance of these changes for disease susceptibility remains a matter of ongoing investigation. Some research has found that depressed individuals show poorer responses to vaccines, suggesting that psychological state can influence the body's ability to mount an effective immune response to specific challenges. Loneliness has emerged as another psychological factor with apparent immune consequences, with lonely individuals showing gene expression patterns indicative of increased inflammation and reduced antiviral responses. The inflammation hypothesis of depression represents an interesting example of bidirectional influence between immune function and mental states. This hypothesis proposes that elevated inflammatory activity may contribute to the development of depression in some individuals, rather than depression being purely a brain disorder that secondarily affects immune function. Evidence for this hypothesis includes observations that inflammatory conditions and immune-activating treatments can trigger depressive symptoms, that depressed individuals often show elevated markers of inflammation, and that anti-inflammatory treatments have shown antidepressant effects in some clinical trials. If this hypothesis is correct, it suggests a more complex picture in which immune activity and mental states mutually influence each other in feedback loops that can stabilize around either healthy or pathological equilibria. The study of meditation and other contemplative practices has provided another window into how mental training can alter physiological processes. Meditation traditions have existed for thousands of years across multiple cultures, but scientific investigation of their effects began in earnest only in the latter half of the 20th century. Early research focused primarily on the physiological correlates of meditative states, documenting changes in brainwave patterns, heart rate, blood pressure, and other parameters during meditation practice. More recent research has examined whether regular meditation practice produces lasting changes in brain structure and function that persist outside of meditative states. Neuroimaging studies have found that experienced meditators show structural differences in brain regions associated with attention, emotional regulation, and interoceptive awareness compared to non-meditators. However, interpreting these findings is complicated by the fact that cross-sectional comparisons cannot determine whether meditation practice caused these differences, or whether individuals with certain brain characteristics were more likely to become dedicated meditators. Longitudinal studies that measure brain changes before and after meditation training provide stronger evidence for causal effects, and several such studies have found changes in grey matter density and white matter connectivity following meditation programs lasting from several weeks to several months. The functional significance of these structural changes is not always clear, and the relationship between observed brain changes and clinical outcomes like reduced anxiety or improved attention remains an active area of investigation. One particularly well-documented effect of meditation training involves alterations in the brain's default mode network, a set of interconnected regions that are most active when the mind is wandering and least active during focused attention tasks. The default mode network has been associated with self-referential thinking, rumination, and mind wandering, and its overactivity has been linked to depression and anxiety. Regular meditation practice appears to reduce resting activity in the default mode network and strengthen connectivity between the default mode network and brain regions involved in cognitive control. These changes may underlie the reductions in rumination and self-focused worry that meditators often report, though establishing causal relationships between specific neural changes and particular psychological outcomes remains methodologically challenging. The emerging field of contemplative neuroscience has begun to investigate the neural correlates of various meditation practices and the specific mechanisms through which different types of training produce their effects. Focused attention meditation, which involves maintaining concentration on a single object such as the breath, appears to strengthen neural circuits involved in selective attention and executive control. Open monitoring meditation, which involves maintaining a broad awareness of whatever arises in experience without focusing on anything in particular, appears to enhance the ability to detect and disengage from the emotional responses. Loving-kindness meditation, which involves generating feelings of warmth and compassion toward oneself and others, has been associated with changes in brain regions involved in emotional processing and social cognition. These distinctions are important because different meditation practices may be suited to different clinical applications, and matching specific practices to specific therapeutic goals may enhance treatment efficacy. The gut-brain axis represents another domain in which the interconnection between mental states and bodily processes has become increasingly apparent. The gastrointestinal tract contains an extensive neural network, sometimes called the enteric nervous system, which contains roughly as many neurons as the spinal cord and can operate largely independently of the central nervous system. Communication between the gut and brain occurs through multiple pathways, including the vagus nerve, the immune system, and various hormones and neurotransmitters. The gut also houses trillions of microorganisms that collectively comprise the gut microbiome, and research has begun to reveal that these microorganisms may influence brain function and behavior through multiple mechanisms. The composition of the gut microbiome has been associated with various psychological conditions, including depression, anxiety, and autism spectrum disorders, though establishing causal relationships remains challenging. Animal studies have provided some of the strongest evidence for causal effects, demonstrating that transferring gut microbiota from animals with particular behavioral characteristics to germ-free animals can transfer those behavioral characteristics as well. Human studies have found that probiotic supplementation can alter stress responses and cognitive function in healthy volunteers, though effects tend to be modest and not always replicable across studies. The mechanisms through which gut microorganisms might influence brain function are still being elucidated and likely include effects on neurotransmitter production, immune signaling, and the integrity of the gut barrier. The phenomenon of psychogenic illness provides particularly striking examples of how mental states can produce physical symptoms. Conversion disorder, historically known as hysteria, involves the development of neurological symptoms such as paralysis, blindness, or seizures that cannot be explained by structural damage to the nervous system. These symptoms are genuine in the sense that patients are not consciously faking them, yet they do not correspond to the patterns that would be expected from actual neurological damage. Neuroimaging studies of patients with conversion disorder have found patterns of brain activity that differ from both healthy controls and patients consciously simulating similar symptoms, suggesting that the generation of these symptoms involves neural mechanisms that operate outside conscious awareness. Mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, occurs when clusters of individuals develop similar symptoms in the absence of any identifiable environmental or infectious cause. Historical examples include the dancing plagues of the medieval Europe, in which large numbers of people danced uncontrollably for days or weeks, and more recent outbreaks of symptoms such as fainting, nausea, and respiratory distress in schools and factories. These episodes typically begin with one or a few individuals developing symptoms, which then spread to others through a process that appears to involve social transmission of anxiety and heightened attention to bodily sensations. Understanding mass psychogenic illness requires recognizing that the symptoms are real to those experiencing them, even though they have no basis in physical pathology, and that social and psychological factors can produce coordinated physical effects across groups of individuals. The relationship between mental imagery and physiological processes has been investigated through various experimental paradigms that reveal surprising degrees of connection between imagined and actual experiences. When individuals vividly imagine performing a physical movement, the motor cortex shows patterns of activation similar to those observed during actual movement execution, though typically at lower intensity. This phenomenon has been exploited in rehabilitation settings, where mental practice has been used to supplement physical practice in helping patients recover motor function after stroke or other injuries. Studies have found that combining mental and physical practice can produce better outcomes than physical practice alone, suggesting that imagined movement engages some of the same neural plasticity mechanisms as actual movement. Similarly, imagining emotional scenes can produce physiological changes characteristic of the imagined emotion, including changes in heart rate, skin conductance, and hormone levels. This observation has implications for understanding how rumination and worry maintain anxiety and depression, as repeated mental rehearsal of threatening or distressing scenarios may repeatedly trigger stress responses even in the absence of any actual threat. Cognitive therapies for anxiety and depression often target these patterns of maladaptive mental imagery, teaching patients to modify or disengage from distressing mental content. The physiological consequences of such mental habits also have implications for understanding how creative visualization and positive imagery practices might influence health outcomes, though the evidence for significant health benefits from such practices remains limited and methodologically complicated. The study of psychosomatic medicine has a long and somewhat controversial history that reflects broader shifts in how the medical profession has understood the relationship between psychological and physical factors in disease. In the mid-20th century, the psychosomatic movement proposed that specific psychological conflicts and personality types were causally related to specific physical diseases. Ulcers, for example, were attributed to repressed dependency needs, while asthma was linked to separation anxiety and hypertension to suppressed hostility. These specific formulations have not held up well, as our understanding of these diseases has advanced, with ulcers now known to be largely caused by bacterial infection and hypertension, recognized as a complex condition with multiple genetic and environmental contributors. However, the failure of specific psychosomatic theories should not be taken to mean that psychological factors play no role in physical disease. Rather, the relationship appears to be more general and less disease-specific than early psychosomatic theorists proposed. Psychological distress of various kinds appears to increase risk for a wide range of physical conditions through mechanisms that include chronic activation of stress response systems, behavioral changes such as reduced exercise and increased substance use, and alterations in immune and inflammatory processes. The challenge for contemporary research is to understand these general mechanisms in sufficient detail to develop targeted interventions that can reduce disease risk by addressing psychological factors while avoiding the oversimplifications and unwarranted specificity of earlier psychosomatic theories. The placebo surgery phenomenon provides particularly compelling evidence for the power of expectations in influencing health outcomes. In several conditions, sham surgical procedures in which patients undergo anesthesia and incisions, but no actual therapeutic intervention, have been compared to real surgical procedures in randomized trials. In some cases, the sham procedures have produced outcomes indistinguishable from the real surgeries. A notable example involves arthroscopic knee surgery for osteoarthritis, where a trial published in 2002 found that patients who received sham surgery showed the same improvement in pain and function as those who received the actual procedure. Similar findings have emerged for certain spinal surgeries and other orthopedic interventions. These results do not mean that all surgery works through placebo mechanisms, but they do suggest that the therapeutic effects of some procedures may owe more to the elaborate treatment context and patient expectations than to the specific physical interventions performed. The ethical implications of placebo research have generated considerable debate within medicine and bioethics. Traditional medical ethics emphasize that effective treatments should be used and that deceiving patients, even for their own benefit, violated the principle of respect for autonomy. However, if placebo mechanisms can produce genuine physiological changes and clinical benefits, dismissing them as mere illusion or trickery seems to miss something important. Some researchers have proposed that placebo effects could be harnessed ethically through open-label placebos, in which patients are explicitly told that they are receiving an inert treatment, but are also informed about research suggesting that placebos can produce real benefits, even when people know they are placebos. Preliminary studies of open-label placebos have produced encouraging results in conditions including irritable bowel syndrome, chronic low back pain, and cancer-related fatigue. Though this research is still in relatively early stages and many questions remain about the durability and generalizability of these effects. The relationship between mental states and physical health extends beyond the individual level to encompass social and cultural factors that operate at the population level. Socioeconomic status is one of the most robust predictors of health outcomes across virtually all conditions studied, and while much of this association reflects material factors such as access to healthcare, nutrition, and safe living conditions, psychological and social mechanisms also appear to play important roles. The chronic stress associated with economic insecurity, social marginalization, and lack of control over one's circumstances takes a cumulative toll on health through the mechanisms described earlier. Additionally, social hierarchies appear to influence health through pathways that involve perceived relative status rather than absolute material conditions, a finding that has been documented in both human populations and non-human primate societies. The concept of allostatic load has been developed to capture the cumulative physiological toll of chronic stress exposure over the life course. Allostatic load is typically measured using a composite index of biomarkers, including cortisol levels, inflammatory markers, cardiovascular parameters, and metabolic indicators. Higher allostatic load scores are associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, functional impairment, and mortality, and allostatic load has been shown to partially mediate the relationship between socioeconomic factors and health outcomes. This framework helps explain how early life adversity can influence health decades later, as the physiological changes associated with chronic stress in childhood may persist and accumulate throughout life, even if circumstances improve later. The investigation of how social relationships influence health has produced findings that parallel in many ways the research on individual psychological states. Social isolation and loneliness are associated with increased mortality risk comparable to well-established risk factors such as smoking and obesity. The mechanisms underlying these associations include both behavioral pathways, as socially isolated individuals may engage in less healthy behaviors and receive less encouragement and support for health-promoting activities, and direct physiological pathways involving stress responses and immune function. Loneliness appears to be particularly potent as a health risk factor, and importantly, loneliness is not the same as social isolation. Individuals can feel lonely even when surrounded by others if their social connections lack quality or depth, and this subjective experience of loneliness appears to carry health risks independent of objective social network size. The field of behavioral medicine has developed interventions that target psychological and behavioral factors to improve physical health outcomes. Cognitive behavioral therapy has been shown to produce benefits in conditions including chronic pain, insomnia, and various functional gastrointestinal disorders. Stress management interventions have shown effects on cardiovascular risk factors and immune function in some studies. Mindfulness-based interventions have been adapted for various medical conditions and have shown promise in reducing symptom burden and improving quality of life, though their effects on underlying disease processes remain less well established. The challenge for this field is to identify which interventions work best for which conditions and through which mechanisms, moving beyond the general demonstration that psychological factors matter towards specific actionable recommendations for clinical practice. The brain's role as the organ that generates mental states while also regulating virtually every bodily system creates the biological foundation for mind-body interactions. Neural pathways connect the cerebral cortex, where conscious thoughts and intentions are processed, to subcortical structures including the hypothalamus, which controls the body's major hormonal systems, and the brain stem, which regulates autonomic functions such as heart rate, breathing, and digestion. These connections allow cognitive and emotional processes to influence the body's physiological state, while feedback from bodily systems influences brain function and conscious experience. This bidirectional architecture means that the separation between mind and body, while useful for some purposes, represents an abstraction from a reality in which mental and physical processes are continuously interacting. The concept of the extended mind raises interesting questions about where mental processes are located and whether they might extend beyond the boundaries of the brain and body. According to this view, cognitive processes can incorporate external tools, resources, and even other people in ways that make them genuine parts of an extended cognitive system. While this philosophical framework does not directly address questions about how mental states influence physical health, it does highlight the importance of environmental and social factors in shaping mental processes. The social brain hypothesis, which proposes that the evolution of the large brains in primates was driven by the demands of managing complex social relationships, also points to the fundamentally social nature of human cognition and the inadequacy of viewing the mind as something confined within individual skulls. Neurofeedback represents an approach to mental training that makes use of real-time displays of brain activity to help individuals learn to regulate their own neural states. By receiving continuous feedback about their brain's electrical activity through EEG or about blood flow patterns through functional MRI, individuals can learn to intentionally modulate neural processes that are normally outside conscious awareness. Neurofeedback has been investigated as a treatment for various conditions including attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, epilepsy, and chronic pain, with mixed results across different studies and conditions. The theoretical appeal of neurofeedback is that it might provide a more direct route to neural self-regulation than indirect approaches that work through thoughts, behaviors, or environmental modifications, but establishing that it works better than alternative approaches for specific clinical applications remains an ongoing challenge. The phenomenon of learned control over autonomic functions provides another example of how previously automatic processes can be brought under voluntary regulation. Biofeedback training has demonstrated that individuals can learn to control physiological parameters, including heart rate, blood pressure, skin temperature, and muscle tension when provided with appropriate feedback. Some individuals have developed remarkable abilities through extensive practice, with documented cases of yogis and other adepts demonstrating control over functions typically considered entirely involuntary. While extreme cases may not be typical of what most people can achieve, they do suggest that the boundary between voluntary and involuntary control is more flexible than commonly assumed and can be shifted through appropriate training. The investigation of exceptional cases of apparent mind-body influence has presented methodological challenges that illustrate the difficulties of studying phenomena that may occur rarely or under specialized conditions. Reports of individuals who have walked on hot coals without injury, who have consciously controlled pain responses during surgery without anesthesia, or who have demonstrated immune tolerance to toxins that would normally cause illness, are difficult to evaluate because they often lack the controlled conditions necessary to rule out alternative explanations. Some documented cases do suggest remarkable individual differences in the degree to which physiological processes can be voluntarily influenced, but separating genuine phenomena from exaggeration, fraud, or misinterpretation of the normal variability requires careful attention to methodology. The history of hypnosis illustrates both the potential and the pitfalls of investigating altered states of consciousness and their effects on bodily processes. Hypnotic phenomena, including analgesia, suggested hallucinations, and apparent memory alterations have been documented under controlled conditions. The neuroimaging research has found that hypnotic suggestions produce genuine changes in brain activity patterns, rather than simply affecting behavioral reports. However, the nature of hypnosis remains debated, with some researchers viewing it as a distinct altered state, and others viewing it as an expected pattern of response that emerges from social and cognitive factors without requiring any special state change. Regardless of how these theoretical debates are resolved, hypnosis has found clinical applications in pain management, anxiety reduction, and various other contexts where modifying subjective experience has therapeutic value. The development of wearable technologies and mobile health applications has created new possibilities for monitoring and influencing the connections between mental states and physical processes in everyday life. Devices that track heart rate variability, skin conductance, and other physiological parameters can provide users with feedback about their stress levels and relaxation responses throughout the day. Applications that prompt users to engage in brief mindfulness exercises or breathing techniques when stress indicators are elevated attempt to translate research findings about stress management into practical tools for daily use. The effectiveness of these technologies is still being evaluated, and concerns have been raised about the potential for excessive self-monitoring to increase rather than decrease anxiety in some individuals. The relationship between mental states and immune function has particular relevance for understanding individual differences in susceptibility to infectious disease and in responses to vaccines. The observation that stressed individuals show poorer responses to vaccines than their less stressed counterparts has implications for public health, suggesting that the effectiveness of vaccination campaigns might be enhanced by addressing psychosocial factors in addition to ensuring vaccine access. Similarly, research showing that loneliness and depression are associated with elevated inflammatory markers and altered immune function suggest potential targets for interventions aimed at reducing chronic disease risk. However, translating these research findings into practical public health measures requires navigating complexities, including the difficulty of changing deeply rooted social and psychological patterns at the population level. The placebo response in clinical trials continues to pose challenges for the development and testing of new treatments. Rising placebo response rates in trials for conditions including depression, pain, and functional gastrointestinal disorders have made it increasingly difficult to demonstrate that new treatments outperform placebo, potentially preventing effective treatments from reaching patients, while also raising questions about why placebo responses have increased over time. Possible explanations include changes in trial design, patient expectations, and the populations enrolled in trials, but no consensus has emerged about which factors are most important. Some researchers have proposed that rather than viewing the placebo response as an obstacle to be overcome, clinical trials should be designed to harness placebo mechanisms while also testing specific treatment effects, though this approach raises both methodological and ethical complexities. The integration of psychological and biological perspectives in medicine remains incomplete, with most clinical training and practice still organised around a division between mental and physical health that the research evidence increasingly calls into question. Patients with chronic medical conditions frequently experience depression and anxiety, and these psychological conditions appear to worsen medical outcomes in many cases. Conversely, psychological conditions like depression involve biological abnormalities including altered neurotransmitter function, hormone levels, and inflammatory markers that blur the line between mental and physical illness. Integrated care models that address both psychological and physical health within the same treatment context have shown promise in improving outcomes, but implementing such models within healthcare systems structured around specialty silos presents organizational and financial challenges. The investigation of how beliefs and expectations influence physical health extends beyond individual psychology to encompass cultural beliefs about health, illness, and healing. Different cultures have developed different concepts of the body, different explanatory models for illness, and different expectations about what treatments should accomplish. These cultural frameworks shape how individuals interpret bodily sensations, what they expect from healthcare encounters, and how they respond to various interventions. Cross-cultural research has documented that the placebo response varies across cultural contexts, though disentangling cultural factors from other variables such as healthcare system characteristics and socio-economic conditions is methodologically challenging. The growing recognition of cultural influences on health experiences has led to increased attention to cultural competence in healthcare delivery, though translating this recognition into concrete practices that improve outcomes remains an ongoing challenge. The question of consciousness and its relationship to brain activity represents a fundamental puzzle that underlies many discussions of mind-body interactions. How subjective experiences arise from physical processes in the brain remains one of the deepest unsolved problems in science, sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. While research has identified many neural correlates of conscious states, finding that particular patterns of brain activity accompany particular conscious experiences, the relationship between these neural events and the experiences themselves remains mysterious. Different philosophical positions on this question have different implications for how we understand the possibility of mental causation, the ability of mental states to influence physical outcomes in ways that go beyond the causal powers of the underlying neural activity. The reductive physicalist view holds that mental states are identical to brain states, and therefore have no causal powers separate from those brain states. On this view, when we say that a belief or expectation influences health outcomes, we are really saying that certain brain states influence health outcomes, and the mental description is simply a convenient shorthand for something that could in principle be described in entirely physical terms. Critics of this view argue that it fails to account for the qualitative character of conscious experience, the sense of what it is like to be in a particular mental state, which seems to be something over and above the physical properties of brain activity. Alternative views, including property dualism and various forms of panpsychism, attempt to accommodate the qualitative character of experience, while avoiding the problems associated with traditional substance dualism. For practical purposes, the philosophical resolution of these questions may be less important than the empirical investigation of the conditions under which mental and physical processes influence each other. Regardless of the ultimate metaphysical relationship between mind and body, we can study how interventions that target thoughts, beliefs, and emotions influence physiological processes and health outcomes. This pragmatic approach has driven much of the research described in this discussion, focusing on identifying mechanisms and developing applications without awaiting resolution of deeper philosophical puzzles. At the same time, conceptual clarity about what we mean when we talk about mental states influencing physical processes can help avoid confusion and sharpen research questions. The role of attention in shaping both conscious experience and physiological responses represents an area where research has begun to clarify mechanisms through which mental processes influence bodily states. Attention functions as a selective filter that determines which among the vast array of incoming sensory information and internally generated thoughts will enter conscious awareness and influence subsequent processing. The direction of attention can modulate pain perception, with pain-relevant attention amplifying pain experience and distraction reducing it. This observation has clinical applications in acute pain contexts where distraction techniques can reduce the need for pharmacological analgesia. The neural mechanisms through which attention modulates sensory processing have been extensively studied, revealing top-down signals from frontal and parietal cortices that bias processing in sensory areas toward attended stimuli. The phenomenon of interoception, the perception of internal bodily states, has received increasing research attention as a pathway through which psychological factors might influence health. Individuals differ in their sensitivity to internal signals such as heartbeat, breathing, and gut sensations, and these differences have been associated with various psychological outcomes, including emotional awareness, anxiety sensitivity, and response to meditation training. Accurate interoceptive awareness may support effective self-regulation by providing timely information about physiological states that can guide adaptive responses, while distorted interoception may contribute to conditions such as panic disorder, in which normal bodily sensations are misinterpreted as signs of imminent catastrophe. Training in interoceptive awareness, which is a component of many contemplative practices, may enhance the ability to regulate emotional and physiological states effectively. The investigation of how mortality awareness influences psychological and behavioral processes has revealed complex effects that go beyond simple fear responses. Terror management theory, developed in social psychology, proposes that awareness of mortality creates a potential for existential anxiety that humans manage through cultural worldviews that provide meaning and symbolic immortality. Research in this tradition has found that reminders of mortality can intensify adherence to cultural values, increase hostility toward those who threaten worldview validity, and motivate self-esteem enhancing behavior. These effects suggest that the awareness of death, a mental content with no immediate physical reality, can have significant influences on cognition, emotion, and behavior through processes that operate largely outside conscious awareness. The study of how early life experiences shape later health outcomes has revealed sensitive periods during development when the effects of environmental factors may be particularly potent and lasting. Adverse childhood experiences including abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction have been associated with increased risk for a wide range of adult health problems, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, and mental disorders. The mechanisms linking early adversity to later health problems appear to include persistent alterations in stress response systems, epigenetic changes that affect gene expression, and behavioral patterns developed as adaptations to early environments that become maladaptive in other contexts. These findings have significant implications for prevention, suggesting that interventions early in life may have larger health benefits than interventions implemented later, though such interventions raise complex ethical and practical questions about how to identify children at risk and how to support families without stigmatization. The role of meaning and purpose in health has been investigated through research on psychological constructs such as sense of coherence, meaning in life, and purpose in life. These constructs, while conceptually related, capture somewhat different aspects of the experience of living a meaningful existence. Studies have found that higher levels of meaning and purpose are associated with better health outcomes, including reduced mortality risk, better cardiovascular health, and reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease, though the mechanisms underlying these associations are not fully understood. Possible pathways include more effective coping with stress, greater engagement in health-promoting behaviors, stronger social connections, and direct physiological effects on stress response and immune function. Whether meaning and purpose are modifiable through intervention, and whether increasing them would produce health benefits represents an important question for future research. The investigation of the placebo response in psychiatric conditions presents particular complexities because the outcomes of interest are typically subjective experiences rather than objective biomarkers. depression trials have been particularly plagued by high placebo response rates, which have made it difficult to demonstrate the superiority of new antidepressant medications over placebo. Explanations for this phenomenon include the effects of supportive attention from clinical trial staff, the hope and positive expectations generated by trial participation, and possible regression to the mean as patients who enroll during particularly severe episodes naturally improve over time. Some researchers have argued that a significant portion of the benefit from antidepressant medications may itself be due to placebo effects, mediated by the experience of taking a treatment and expecting improvement. Though this interpretation remains controversial, the relationship between physical activity and mental health illustrates bidirectional influences between bodily states and psychological processes. Exercise has been shown to reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety, with effects comparable to pharmacotherapy in some studies. The mechanisms underlying these effects likely include acute effects of exercise on neurotransmitter systems and endorphin release, as well as longer-term effects on neuroplasticity, inflammation, and stress response systems. Conversely, mental states influence physical activity through motivation, perceived energy, and the interpretation of exertion sensations. Depression and anxiety can reduce engagement in physical activity, potentially creating vicious cycles in which reduced activity worsens mental health, which further reduces activity. Understanding these bidirectional influences has implications for designing interventions that effectively break such cycles. The study of how sleep influences the relationship between mental states and physical health has revealed the importance of this fundamental biological process for both psychological and physical functioning. Sleep deprivation impairs cognitive function, emotional regulation, and immune function, while increasing inflammatory markers and disrupting metabolic processes. Chronic sleep problems are associated with increased risk for a wide range of conditions, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, and depression. Psychological factors including stress, anxiety, and rumination can disrupt sleep, potentially creating another pathway through which mental states influence physical health. Interventions that improve sleep quality, including cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, may therefore have broader health benefits beyond their direct effects on sleep. The emerging understanding of the brain as a predictive organ has implications for how we understand the generation of conscious experience and the influence of expectations on perception and physiology. According to predictive processing theories, the brain continuously generates predictions about incoming sensory information based on prior experience and current context, and perception emerges from the comparison between predictions and actual sensory input. Unexpected sensory input generates prediction errors that update internal models and capture attention, while expected input is efficiently processed with minimal computational resources. This framework helps explain placebo and nocebo effects as instances where strong predictions about treatment effects shape the processing of bodily signals, potentially altering both conscious experience and downstream physiological responses. The investigation of collective psychological phenomena and their health implications extends beyond individual psychology to consider how shared beliefs, social movements, and cultural changes influence population health. Historical analyses have documented how major social changes, including war, economic depression, and political transformation, produce measurable effects on mortality, fertility, and disease patterns that cannot be fully explained by changes in material conditions alone. The psychological states associated with social upheaval, including fear, uncertainty, hope, and solidarity, appear to influence health through multiple pathways, including stress responses, behavioral changes, and alterations in social cohesion. Understanding these population-level processes requires integrating perspectives from demography, sociology, history, and psychology in ways that remain methodologically challenging. The relationship between religious and spiritual practices and health outcomes has been the subject of considerable research, though interpreting findings in this area presents particular challenges. Epidemiological studies have found that regular religious service attendance is associated with lower mortality risk, though disentangling the effects of religious practice per se from associated factors such as social support, health behaviours, and socioeconomic characteristics is difficult. Some research has focused on specific practices such as prayer and meditation, that might influence health through psychological and physiological mechanisms, while other research has examined broader constructs such as religious coping and spiritual well-being. The diversity of religious and spiritual practices across traditions makes generalizations difficult, and the potential for confounding by unmeasured variables remains a concern in observational research. The neuroscience of belief has begun to reveal some of the brain mechanisms through which beliefs are formed, maintained, and changed, with implications for understanding how belief modification might influence health. Belief formation involves integration of sensory evidence, prior knowledge, emotional valuation, and social information in circuits that include the prefrontal cortex, temporal lobes, and limbic structures. Strongly held beliefs may be maintained even in the face of contradictory evidence through motivated reasoning processes that recruit emotional and reward systems. Understanding these mechanisms has implications for health communication and behavior change interventions, as simply providing accurate information may not be sufficient to change beliefs that are emotionally invested or socially reinforced. The development of personalized medicine approaches has begun to consider psychological factors alongside genetic and biomarker information in predicting treatment responses. Individual differences in placebo responsiveness, stress reactivity, and other psychological characteristics may influence how patients respond to various treatments, and incorporating this information into treatment selection could potentially improve outcomes. Similarly, understanding how personality traits, coping styles, and social circumstances influence disease risk and progression could inform preventive interventions tailored to individual risk profiles. Realizing this vision of psychologically informed precision medicine requires further research to identify which psychological factors are most important for which conditions and how they interact with biological and environmental factors. The philosophical tradition of phenomenology, which focuses on the structure of first-person experience, offers conceptual resources for understanding the lived experience of illness and health that complement objective biomedical perspectives. Phenomenological analyses have explored how illness transforms the relationship between the experiencing subject and the body, disrupting the taken-for-granted background of bodily functioning that normally supports engagement with the world. These analyses illuminate why the experience of illness cannot be fully captured by objective measurements of disease parameters, and why attention to patients' subjective experiences is essential for providing effective healthcare. The integration of phenomenological insights with empirical research on mind-body interactions remains an ongoing project that promises to enrich both theoretical understanding and clinical practice. The investigation of how mental states influence physical outcomes continues to generate new findings and raise new questions, reflecting the complexity of the systems involved and the challenges of studying phenomena that span traditional disciplinary boundaries. The evidence accumulated over recent decades makes clear that the old dichotomy between mind and body is inadequate for understanding how thoughts, emotions, and beliefs interact with physiological processes to influence health and disease. At the same time, much remains uncertain about the magnitude of these effects in different contexts, the mechanisms through which they operate, and the best ways to harness them for therapeutic benefit. The ongoing dialogue between rigorous empirical research and careful conceptual analysis will be essential for continuing progress in this domain, as will the integration of findings across the many disciplines that contribute to understanding the relationship between mental states and physical outcomes.